Welcome everybody to a special workshop. This is going to be very important for both NuView clients and non-NuView clients as we take a little dive into some proposed legislation that could have an impact on not only self-directed IRAs, but IRAs in general. And I've got a special guest, President of NuView Trust Company, Jason DeBono, here with me as well. Let me just kind of lay out what's going to happen today, and I want this to be interactive, so if you guys have questions, don't hesitate to type your questions into the chat box. But let's just talk about what we're going to go over today when we talk about this new legislation that could be coming down the road. So what we're going to cover is a piece of what's called the Build Back Better agenda. And what this is this is the current administration's plan to increase spending over the next 10 years. And there's different pieces of this plan, and what we're really going to focus on today is really just the retirement aspect of the plan. And when you look into the plan, what you want to keep in mind is there's a committee called the Ways and Means Committee that's the chief tax writing committee for the Build Back Better agenda. And they have a lot of things that they've covered in their proposal that covers retirement accounts, and specifically self-directed retirement accounts. And we're going to literally go piece by piece on the retirement section and talk about what type of impact this may have if the plan passes as is, and if you are opposed to these proposed changes, what you can do about it. So we're going to cover a couple different things. How is this proposal going to affect your retirement if it passes as is? What's the impact this plan has to Roth IRAs? The impact it could have to 401ks and qualified plans? What will happen to your investment options going forward if the plan passes as is? What's the effect of currently held in alternative investments? And what can you do to stop these proposed changes? So, Jason, are you with me? Can you hear me?
Yeah. Hey, good to be here. And, it's definitely an area of importance that everybody needs to understand what is being out there. Only piece I'll just kind of add is none of this is in effect. This is all proposed. So the good news is that there's still plenty of time for us to do stuff, and we'll talk today about some of the things that we're doing as an organization and then the industry groups that we belong to. But we have to make our voices heard. If it passes as is, it's very scary. The likelihood of that happening really does depend on how much work and effort we all put into making sure people know that this isn't the way we want this to go.
Very, very well said. And if anybody has the urge to look into this, we're really going to piece it piece by piece, and we're going to cover it basically from start to finish. There's some parts that probably won't be relevant to a lot of people, but stick with us because there's a piece of legislation in all of this that may have an impact to you regardless of how much money you make, regardless of how much money you have saved in retirement. But we're going to just cover it piece by piece so you have a full grasp of what these proposed changes may or may not be if it's passed as is. So let's just jump into it. And again, I encourage people to ask questions, type them into the chat box. I'll try to round up questions as we go and insert them in the areas where we're talking about those questions, or we may just take some questions at the end if we don't get to them right away. So let's just jump right into it. So the first thing when you look at the Ways and Means Committee's proposal, if you look up the Ways and Means Committee's proposal and you go to part 3 of the proposal, this is where it really starts talking about retirement accounts. And the first piece of this proposal talks about limiting the amount an individual can save in a retirement account. A lot of this has to do with, we've had news, we've had things in the news like Peter Thiel, the co-founder of PayPal, who took a $2,000 Roth IRA and turned it into a $2 billion or $5 billion Roth IRA. And a lot of this is driven by things like that. But again, we want to keep in mind what this may have is impact to anybody that's looking to save for retirement plans. And I thought that this was really interesting because this is the first time I think in history that they are proposing to put a limit or a cap on what you're allowed to save in a retirement plan. Here's kind of some bullet points on the section. And Jason, you want to kind of give us your grasp on this or your take on this?
Yeah. Thanks, Nate, for teeing this up. This is an area I would say of all the items that we're going to discuss, this one is probably will have the least amount of impact or the most amount of impact to very few people. Getting a $10 million IRA is incredibly hard. And what this is saying is that it's capping out IRAs at $10 million. The whole premise here is to ensure that the Peter Thiel example is one, but while we may not be impacted by this at some point, it's still scary to see the start of a lid being put on. I think what we ought to be concerned about is not whether or not we as individuals will get to 10 million. I sincerely hope everybody on today's webinar does, certainly self-included, but we all understand that's a monstrous goal and very unlikely. That said, there's nothing to stop 10 million from becoming 9, 7, 8, 5, 2. So that's the part that I think is of concern. There's some additional code, and you guys can read through this. Our job today is not to give you every nuance or detail. It is to keep it at a high level. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to cover some of the more intricate items that are more impactful to our business. But it's going to apply to anyone with income over $400,000. This is their way of saying if you make over 400 grand and you have $10 million, we're going to start forcing you to take money out and stop contributing on an annual basis. So again, written pretty high level, impact to very few, but longer term impact could get a little more scary.
Yeah, and you made a great point there. If it starts at 10, what's preventing it from going to 9 or 8 or 5, 7? And I have heard, through relationships that we have, is that there was a lot of people that thought this was going to come out to be 5 million. So they were glad that it came out to be 10 million. But it does start a scary precedent, I would say. Not that everybody's going to have a $10 million IRA, but Jason, you put it very, very bluntly, is what's there preventing it? Once it starts, where's it end? So very, very, it's going to affect very few people, but again, it starts a strange precedent that we haven't seen before. And that leads us into the next section of the code, which talks about, well, what happens if you do have one of those large dollar IRAs, is they're going to start forcing distributions on individuals that exceed that threshold. So Jason, you want to give us your take on this as well?
Yeah, and I'll keep this at a high level too. What it's saying is if you do go beyond the 10 million, because they can't stop your account, right? There's a little bit of a tug of war here. I can tell you, Nate, that you can no longer add money to your account when you hit 10 million, but what about what's in there? And a $10 million account is generating income. What they're saying is 50% of anything over $10 million will have to be withdrawn every year. So you'll still be able to earn money, but you're going to be forced to withdraw it. So in theory, you'll never have more than 10 million plus 50% of the previous year's earnings.
Correct. So if you have a $15 million stash of retirement funds and you're making above $400,000 a year, they'll force you to take a 50% distribution of what you're in excess. So if you're in excess $5 million, you can expect that you'll have a $2.5 million distribution that it's expected of you the following year. So again, doesn't affect a lot of people, but it is going to cause a big disruption in what people currently have saved if they're above these amounts. And again, where does it stop once it starts with this? So again, they're really trying to cap how much we're allowed to save in our retirement accounts, and that's kind of where the start of this goes. And let's look at the next sections and where it really funnels down to more of the everyday investor. And I think this is where you're going to see an attack on the Roth IRA, and specifically Roth conversions. Now, we have always known that the IRS likes to have their hands on the money, and Roth IRAs are a way to get them out of the equation. We do a lot of education about Roth IRAs and the power that they have to create tax-free wealth for an individual and for their future generations. And there's going to be some changes. To the extent we don't know, but there are going to be some changes to the Roth IRA and specifically Roth conversions, and that's going to be in section 138311. One of the biggest things, and I'll let Jason add to this as well, is they're going to put income limits back on. If it passes as is, they're going to put income limits back on Roth conversions. Just to give you a little foundation, prior to 2010, there used to be an income limit to doing a Roth conversion. If you made $100,000 a year or more, you were not allowed to pay taxes on your existing traditional IRAs to convert to a Roth. In 2010, they removed that income limit, and it's been off ever since. And now they're talking about putting that income limit back on for IRAs, but it even goes in deeper and talks about eliminating it completely in 401ks and qualified plans. So this is a little bit scary. Jason, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, you said it, it's scary. So let me kind of give some context, right? And I think the Peter Thiel example is a very prime one. Mitt Romney was also someone many years ago when he was running for president that disclosed he had a 100 plus or 200 plus $1 million retirement account. And what we have to do is make sure that they're not penalizing all of us everyday users of these tools for the very select few. Contextually, when I look at this, the previous code of Roth conversions actually as is probably the best thing that could pass. And the reason is I'd rather them attack the winners at the highest level, right, where they've been able to get success up to $10 million. And I'm not saying it's okay, but if there's anyone that we shouldn't feel bad for, it's those with 10 million plus IRAs. What this is really burdensome for me, and where I'd encourage you guys all to take special note, is the second bullet. Roth conversions aren't so much of an scary item for me if they put some lids back on those. We were all pretty surprised it's been this long without it. And again, you don't want Peter Thiel taking $2,000, putting it into PayPal when he knows it's going to turn into billions of dollars, and using the Roth hole for that. I understand why he did it, and I don't fault him for using the code to his benefit, but I think we'd all agree that's not what everyday savers do. This elimination of the Roth inside of 401ks goes so contrary to what we're trying to do, which is to help people save. And if you take this down to everyday wage earners, right? Forget about the wealthy, wherever you draw that line. Everyday wage earners should be using 401k contributions as a tool to save 100% of the time, and most of them would benefit most from the after-tax contribution because they're not in a tax earning bucket where the discount on their taxes is meaningful. So you're talking about this actually hurts to the core because the wealthiest of people that are in 401k plans probably are using the tax deferred method for the tax savings because it's meaningful at 35%. Someone at 12 or 15% overall tax rate isn't getting any benefit. So this is a tool I've personally used since they enacted this. I believe it was back in 2008. It's allowed me to save in lots of ways, but save tax-free. And the idea of this going away is very scary because this isn't a tax on the rich. This isn't a tax on the people that we want to vilify. Whether you agree with it or not doesn't matter. This is an elimination of a very good quality product and tool for everyday working Americans. And that's, to me, what is the scariest about this section.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I've been saying for a long time that I wouldn't be surprised if they put an income limit back on conversions. And to be honest, I was quite surprised that it was at 400,000 for IRA. So that in itself is not so scary. But as Jason mentioned, when they go to attack 401ks and talk about eliminating after-tax contributions to 401ks and eliminating Roth conversions within a 401k at any income level, well, now you're affecting people that make $20,000 a year, $30,000 a year, who are struggling to save for retirement. And one of the great ways to help save for retirement is through a Roth IRA. And more people are working W-2 jobs and have these employer plans set up for themselves, and it just doesn't make sense that they would attack that piece of it. Now, again, just to remind everybody, none of this has passed, but you can see what they're trying to push down and funnel through the system. And these are the things that we need to be concerned about. Not only for ourselves, but for our future generations too. Think about your kids, think about your grandkids. If some of these changes pass, what's that going to do to their ability to save for retirement, going through the future? I have a couple questions, and I just want to address them so you guys know that we're seeing them. Ed, thank you for the question. If the proposal is passed, will moving the investments to a Roth IRA be permissible? I think we've kind of addressed that. Current assets in a retirement account will not be able to be converted to a Roth if they're in a traditional currently, if you're above the income limit, if it passes as is, And again, if it's within a plan, if you have assets in a 401k, and we forgot to mention solo 401ks, this is going to affect people that have solo 401ks. Our current 401k at NuView allows for the after-tax employee contributions, which is something a lot of self-employed individuals like to have because it increases their ability to save for retirement. They like the ability to be able to do in-plan conversions. This is going to affect the solo 401ks as well as the other 401ks. So Ed, to answer your question, if it passes as is, you're going to be limited as to what you're allowed to move from traditional IRAs to Roth IRAs, and we'll talk about what you should do to counteract that or prepare for that if it passes as is. But thank you for your questions. Let's see.
So Nate, I'm gonna, if you don't mind, let me just hop in for a little history lesson for those that may not have been familiar with IRAs in the past. In 2010, up until 2010, there was a conversion limit. So conversion means you have it existing in a traditional or pre-tax IRA and you want to move it to a Roth IRA. Prior to 2010, the limit was only $100,000. They eliminated that in 2010. Again, much to surprise for a lot of us that they didn't do it for a short period of time. They did it because as people converted, it generated tax revenue into the Treasury. This proposal would not eliminate Roth conversions. It would just set the limit on your income to be eligible at $400,000. That's not scary. In fact, if it went and passed as is, I would say probably a win overall because they're going to get some of this in some way, right? I mean, maybe in wishful thinking, in a perfect world, every section we're going to discuss gets eliminated. When you see stuff like this, you really have to focus on what's best case. Lobbying efforts, and we're part of 3 different groups that are all lobbying heavily, and I'll talk about some of those here in a bit. But the part that we're concerned about is not the limit on Roth conversions at 400 grand. Again, it would affect so few. What we're really concerned about for the sake of American savers is the elimination, understand that that's an elimination regardless of your income, of 401k Roth contributions, which is the way most Roth accounts today are being funded, is it's being withdrawn out of people's paychecks. So I am a W-2 employee, as is Nate, and we have a 401k that has Roth provisions inside it, which is great. The thing that people don't realize about this is that we're paying our tax little by little. So if I save $1 million, right, when I get to retirement, I have $1 million. If I'm forced back into the traditional, it's going to save me a few pennies, right, on my tax return, which I'm not going to notice or probably spend on a new TV when I get my tax return. And all I'm going to end up with is the same $1 million retirement account that I now have to pay taxes on before I can spend it. So that $1 million of saved money is probably, and who knows where taxes will be then, but at 20%, that's only $800,000. I've just decreased my ability to live on that money for 20%. Now let that sink in. That means I either have to spend 20% less month over month or I have to retire and live on that for 20% less time. Either one of those are not the type of behavior we want to give to our working class saving Americans. And that is a very, very scary provision. So yes, the Roth conversion stuff, yeah, we're all kind of going, it is what it is, fine, no problem. You can't end up with a $10 million IRA. Or if you make $1 million a year, you're not going to be eligible to convert. Again, life will go on, they'll figure it out. But you start taking away the ability for those of us that are W-2 employees, which is the vast majority of savers in today that need retirement accounts. That elimination of that is really taking something that's near and dear to all of us away.
Yeah, and you look at it and you think, what does this have to do with large dollar IRAs? Because it really goes contrary to what the beginning part of the proposals are, which are eliminating how much somebody can save in a retirement account. And if this is geared to the Build Back Better plan, which is a 10-year spending plan, how does preventing somebody from making after-tax contribution help that problem? It almost goes the opposite, right? If you're not allowing people to pay taxes on their contribution and just defer taxes, well, what if they're past 10 years from retirement or 20 years from retirement? That doesn't increase any additional income to the IRS, to help pay for some of these things. So, some of this stuff, again, we're not getting political here. We're just kind of trying to, navigate through these proposals and figure out what makes sense and what's going to, impact us the most. A couple questions I want to address. Ralph, thank you for your question. He says, what are some of the solutions, let's say if this passed? Hypothetically, let's say, some of this passes as is, and I'll let you add to this as well, Jason. If we're talking about this specifically, the Roth conversions and primarily the elimination of it within 401ks, what are some workarounds, I would say? Well, it's going to force a lot of people to open actual Roth IRAs and not just count on their 401k to help save for retirement. Now, obviously, if you're working at a company that has your 401k set up for you, it's very hard to roll, assets out of the 401k into an IRA. But it's going to just force people to start moving assets out of their 401k to a maybe a traditional IRA and converting outside of the plan, which is just now they're making multiple steps to get a conversion done. And obviously, you have to be under the income limit to do a conversion in a Roth IRA. And another thing that I would probably say is the first thing that dawned on me is, well, now you got to start looking at some of the other plans that are not mentioned in this bill that give you tax savings. Because if you can't maximize Roth IRAs because you're limited based on the proposals, well, now you're going to have to start looking at some of those accounts you maybe not have been thinking about as much, which is your HSAs and even your education savings accounts, because those give you some tax shelter, and none of those are mentioned or attacked within this bill. Just some things that I thought about. Jason, anything that you can think of as far as workarounds, hypothetically, if these proposals passed as is?
No, I think you hit on it. I think we're all kind of saving too much thought processes to what does this really mean until we get a little better understanding of what's likely to pass and what's not. But people are resilient. They'll figure ways around it so much as they can.
Yeah. Natalie asked, this is only for employer 401k plans or traditional Roth IRAs? Just to recap, Natalie, based on what the proposal says, there will be an income limit on IRA conversions, so traditional to Roth conversions, and that limit is said to be $400,000 a year. So if you make above $400,000 a year, you will not be allowed to convert traditional IRAs to Roth IRAs. But also, if you have a 401k or a qualified plan, they are eliminating conversions regardless of income. So there's an income limit for IRA conversions, but in the plan it's stating that there's going to be no income limit at all. You cannot do a conversion regardless of how much you make within a 401k. So let's move on. So great questions, guys. Keep them coming. Now this is going to start getting into some different investment options. This is where we're outside of IRAs specifically, and now we're talking about investment options, which is a little bit scary of a thing, because especially with self-directed IRAs, the powerful thing about self-directed IRAs is it allows investors to apply their knowledge as an investor to invest in alternative assets, things that aren't tied to Wall Street. And these next things that we're going to cover are going to limit what you're allowed to invest in if they pass as is. And the first one is section 138.312, which talks about the prohibition of a IRA investments based on the account holder status as an accredited investor. And I know, Jason, that this is one that kind of tweaked you as well me. So give us your take on this, where we're talking about accredited investors.
Yeah, so Nate made the point. I want to highlight it because it's exactly why we kind of look at these individually. The first two things we talked about really had nothing to do with what you invest in, right? They simply talked about your account. The reason why I'm in favor of some of those, if I have to pick my poison, is because I'd much rather than limit me at the high end or limit me when my income reaches a certain point versus limiting me when I want to make an investment. Because the real power of retirement accounts is tax advantage savings coupled with good prudent investing. And having been in this industry for 16 years, it's near and dear to my heart that investors get access to what they want to invest into. And there are some rules, and those rules have to be followed, and I believe those rules are very fair, and I encourage everyone to follow them. So I'm not a push the envelope guy. I'm probably more conservative from an investment standpoint. But what this section is saying is it's saying that any investment that has any sort of status requirement for the investor, it will become prohibited. This may not seem like something that impacts you, but it impacts probably almost 40% of our account holders. When you buy into individual pieces of real estate or you buy into a private loan or anything along those lines, this doesn't matter, right? There's some future sections that this doesn't matter. But when you invest into what we would refer to more as packaged private investments, these look like Wall Street, but they're Main Street assets. So it doesn't matter where you reside. I can give you examples of these. Apartment complexes, many of those are syndicated, and a lot of those are investors using IRAs. Senior housing, self-storage, real estate plazas, you know, as a Florida guy, Publix plazas tend to have a lot of syndications tied to them. A lot of gas stations, grocery chains have some sort of real estate that's been syndicated out. That's big stuff, but there's a lot of mom and pop stuff. Community banks. Every community bank raises money on a syndication, and many of those investors put IRA money into those. All of those investments have limitations on accredited investor status. The second part is this goes down, so accredited investor is $300,000 of income, filing jointly, $200,000, filing singly, I believe is the number, and forgive me, I haven't looked at them exactly, and there's been some recent changes to them. So this won't impact everybody. However, the piece that this goes so surprisingly against, which is one of the most bipartisan bills I've seen in a long time, is the 2012 Jobs Act, which was the jumpstart of small businesses. The Jobs Act was designed to give small businesses resources outside of banks to go get money. If you hear the term crowdfunding, or you've ever seen Kickstarter, technically would be a form of crowdfunding, although it's not really what you'd invest in, but there's a lot of small, Lending Club is crowdfunding, peer-to-peer lending. These are small accounts that people are investing, or small dollar amounts that are giving them exposure to more institutional level asset classes. So if you make $100,000 a year and you're not an accredited investor, you can't go invest into the local apartment complex that they're developing or redeveloping in your area. But you can invest through crowdfunding, which could actually have the same asset class. So you could go buy only $5,000 of that investment, and it may be limited to 10% of your annual earnings. So if you make 50 grand, you can put 5 grand into it. So it's giving you exposure. This completely eliminates every single aspect of that in a retirement account. And where it gets even scarier is when you reduce that, a lot of people's liquid net worth is in their retirement accounts. So if you think about most people on this call, if you ask yourself, where do you have the easiest accessible liquid funds sitting today? Well, you have a brokerage account inside your retirement plan that has 120 grand in it, right? You probably can't go get 120 grand somewhere else. So these eliminations are, in my opinion, this is the scariest of all of them, because they're attacking choice and there is no alternative. Some of the other sections that are scary that attack choice, there's ways around it already today. But this says, as it stands and as it's written, that you as an investor cannot buy any packaged institutional-like product if there's an accredited investor designation. And that is really scary. So what it's saying is you can't buy institutional level Main Street investments, but they have no problem with you dumping all of your money into Wall Street. And that to me is the part where I draw the line and say, that's not what choice looks like. And you as a government cannot tell me that I have to be a Wall Street based investor. And this really, really strikes to the core of that. And for me is the scariest of all the provisions within here.
Yeah, and again, you ask yourself the question, what does this have to do with increased taxation to help, pay for spending? Giving people less options is not a way to help stimulate growth in a retirement account, especially if they're going to, try to force people into more traditional IRAs that are taxed at the end of the day. Why at the same time eliminate their investment options and force them to invest in Wall Street? Which, again, nothing against Wall Street, but if somebody can make more money through a Main Street investment, an investment that they understand, why would you not let them invest in something that they can make more money in? And why would you instead force them to invest in things that they're not knowledgeable about? 98% of our retirement is already invested in Wall Street, and nearly nobody understands how to make money in Wall Street. So it just doesn't make sense why they would attack investment options. And here's the other scary thing is that this doesn't affect new investments looking forward. This would affect current investments. And there's millions and millions of dollars invested in current syndications or investments that required them to be an accredited investor. And what this proposal adds is that if you're currently investing in such an offering, currently invested with your IRA in such an offering, you have 2 years to liquidate that investment or face your IRA losing its status as an IRA. So what's that going to cause? That's going to cause ultimately a fire sale on some of these investments, because if people want to keep their IRA status as an IRA, they're going to sell off these investments, and that's going to make it it's going to make a huge demand on these things, and people are going to have to sell at a loss. What's going to happen to the people that made the offering? Where are they going to come up with the additional capital to keep their investments going? What's your take on that, Jason? Because I just see this as being a tremendous mess, especially for the people that are already invested in these offerings.
Yeah, I mean, you struck to the core of something that isn't really an issue in everything else, which is it's all go forward basis, right? So I don't like the rules, but at least you change the rules and I have a chance to start following them. This says all the decisions I've made under the rules that were available to me go out the window in 24 months. So I'll give you just some personal investments that I've made through my retirement account. I'm personally invested into a small apartment building as a small limited partner in the Dallas area. And there's about 20 to 25% of the money in that looks just like my IRA. So what that means is within 2 years, the operator of this apartment building that's trying to do good by his or her investors is going to either have to refinance us out. Well, certainly there's only so much money in banks to lend, right? So once all these people start going to the banks for refinancing, they're going to realize we don't have enough money to solve this crisis. There's going to be forced liquidation, which means this product may have to be sold as a whole because they can't just sell 25% of it as a general rule. So it's not, the end result is it's no longer an investment on our terms, it's now an investment on the government's terms. And as an operator of these investments, I couldn't even imagine where to start if I had to return 25% of a $20 million apartment building, right, within 2 years. So, and my options will get bleaker and bleaker as the days and weeks and months go on after this passes, which takes me to another investment that I'm in, which is in a local community bank. That bank provides financing to a lot of small real estate projects. Let's assume that bank, which it is not, is the lender. Well, now they have about 20% of their capital that has to be eliminated. Now, banks have a little easier way, right? They can increase deposits. But what people don't realize is they have capital requirements based on lending exposure. So if you take that 20% of IRA money that's invested into the bank on the shareholder side and reduce it, you've now reduced their capital exposure, which means that their lending exposure goes down. What happens when I can't lend as much? I have to charge more. What happens when I can't lend as much? Deals that wanted to get funded, needed to get funded, can't. So now you have this double-edged sword, which is I, on the apartment complex side, am going to my local bank to get refinanced at a time when they're trying to solve the same problem. It's a very, 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 very scary issue. The good news is we're hearing from a lot of the people, congressional leaders that we've been in contact with over the last week and a half, 2 weeks, that everybody recognizes there's a lot of problems on both sides of the aisle. So, we're part of 3 different industry associations that are all lobbying towards these efforts. One of them is called RITA, the Retirement Industry Trust Association, and they're kind of a trust company-based solution that's really focusing some efforts. There's a group called ADISA, the Alternative Direct Investment Sponsor Association or Securities Association, which is a little more of the package product. And then IPA, the Institute of Portfolio Alternatives, which is really alternative assets that look more institutional but are sold to everyday individual investors. All of those lobbying efforts are geared at different sections that we're discussing, and we're getting good feedback that most of the congressional folks that they're talking with through the process are all either unaware of this language, like it was a surprise to them, and many of them are in full agreement that as written is an absolute disaster. So that's the solace. Now, what that means going forward. What that ultimately gets this altered to, yet to be determined. In a perfect world, obviously, we all have different reasons for different clauses being eliminated in their entirety, or at least at a minimum rewritten. And that's, what these lobbyists are working through now is, what can we meet in the middle? If you can't meet me where we are, can we meet in the middle, and what does that look like? So hopefully that 2 years is something that they put in there, just thinking it would slip through and nobody would read it. But that's probably the area that's garnered the most attention with the congressional leaders, is because they recognize that would be so incredibly detrimental. Forget about what it does to my future about investing. You can't take people's current investments and change the rules. That would never fly on Wall Street, and it certainly shouldn't fly in Main Street.
Great point. Let's attack some questions, because we got a lot of comments coming in. Jim McSorley, thanks for joining in, Jim. So accredited investors would not be able to hold these assets in their IRA. Yes, if the bill passed as is, that's what it's saying. If you are an accredited investor, if the offering requires you to be accredited as an individual, they will not allow your IRA to be invested in that going forward, and you would have to get out of that or unwind those investments within a 2-year period if you're currently invested in it. I'll get to your other question here in a sec, Jim, but I just want to stay on topic. Brian O'Connor, thanks for the question. This actually, me and you were talking about this earlier, Jason, before we jumped on, so I'll let you kind of attack this. But he says, does Section 138312 only apply to those who are accredited, or does this also apply to sophisticated investors investing passively? And that's from Brian. Brian, thanks for the question. You want to take that one, Jace?
Yeah, so the way it's written, and if you read the first bullet, and I'll kind of go down where it says, if the IRA owner to have certain minimum level of assets or income, or have completed a minimum level of education, which is the sophistication side, or license or credentials. So one of the things that we as industry groups have been lobbying for over the years is something that we've had success with, which is expanding the accredited investor to include sophistication. So Nate should not be allowed or disallowed into an investment because he makes money or doesn't. If Nate has a degree in finance, or if Nate has passed an alternative asset or a real estate course, or whatever it may be. The way it's written today, it does not say accredited from amounts. It also does not say accredited based on the high net worth accreditation standard, because most states all have accreditation levels, which is where crowdfunding comes into play. So if I want to make a crowdfunding investment, as a general rule, I have to go by Florida as a Florida resident, Florida's standard, and I believe it may be like 10% of my income, right? So I'm eligible, but under this ruling, the way it's written, I would no longer be eligible to use my IRA because it has an accreditation standard to the investor, which passes on, and therefore my IRA is prohibited.
Yeah, and again, when you read some of this stuff, you could tell, a lot of it was, hastily put together because there is some ambiguity, there's some gray area. But the scary thing is when you have gray area like that, the fact that most of these provisions would take effect as early as January 1st, 2022 is scary, because there's so many unknowns with some of the things that they put in there. So great point there. Again, it could be your level of income, it could be your level of net worth, or it could just be that you're educated in a certain field, which again, it's scary. And I think ultimately Jason nailed it on the head, is that it's scary when you followed the rules going into an investment and then they change it while you're in the investment. It's just not something that we've ever seen before. And there's a huge domino effect that could happen if it passed as is. A couple other questions here. Ken, we're going to address this on the next one. I'll go ahead and state the question so it's a good segue. But his question was 2 questions. Will Roth IRAs continue to be allowed to own 100% of the stock in a pass-through entity? We're going to get to that in a second. And if a pass-through entities are allowed, could we as owners of the Roth IRA still serve as the corporate directors? The quick answer is no, and we're gonna address that here on the next couple slides. And this is what actually we're gonna just cover this one. This doesn't really have an impact to most of us, but again, we want to make sure to be transparent with everything that's in there. One of the things that they want to also add is just increase the statute of limitations, which is really just the look back period the IRS has to find out if you did something wrong with your IRA. So they want to open that envelope a little bit. And this has always been kind of open to 6 years anyways, but they want to make it known that their look back period for prohibited transactions is not 3 years anymore. It's going to be 6 years. So they're going to go increase the amount of time that they can go back. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Jason. I just had that in there as the next slide.
Yeah, I mean, here's what I will add to this, and I'll keep it brief. There's so much contradiction from section to section on what their intent is. If their intent, the way they sound it, is to keep the rich from buying their own investments that go up significantly in value inside Roth IRAs. That's the Peter Thiel example. Why change my investment choices, right? Which is what the last one did. I'm perfectly fine with this. If I've misbehaved, go back and look longer. The problem is Peter Thiel can be as public as he wants about it because he's passed the look back provision. So there's nothing they can do. And so what they're trying to do is say, hey, if you're going to come out, or we're going to realize you have this huge pop, and many of these investments, they sit at very little market value for a long time. It's private company, nothing. And then all of a sudden it IPOs and there's a $20 million cash out. That's all they're trying to accomplish here. As written, I would say not only am I okay with it, I wholeheartedly agree with it. And if you're concerned about, misbehaving, don't misbehave. It's that easy.
Right. So let's get to this one. And this we have a lot of questions that are coming in specific to this. And this is section 138314, the prohibition of investment of IRA assets into entities in which the owner has a substantial interest. There's a couple different things with this. They want to reduce the current percentage of ownership that you're allowed to have in an entity your IRA invests, which is currently 50%. They want to drop this to 10%, which is a drastic move. I'll let Jason add to this as well. But they are also adding to this that an IRA owner can no longer act as an officer of an entity that their IRA owns. So this will attack checkbook control IRAs. And I just wanted to mention that real quick because we have a lot of questions in on that. Jason, go ahead and take it away, your take on this on section 138314.
Yeah, and I'll start with this is opinion, right? We all are entitled to our own. This section isn't as scary, candidly, because they're not attacking choice. So what they're saying is if you own 20 pieces of real estate inside an LLC, we're not saying you can't own 20 pieces of real estate. We're saying that you can't manage or operate the LLC, right, on top of it. I'm not a fan of this because we have a significant amount of clients that have checkbook LLCs that do operate. But I also know as a custodian, on the back end with over $2 billion of assets, there's a lot of people that are using this to their advantage. Now we try to educate, and encourage our clients to do the right thing, but there's a lot of people that have used this to fund their own businesses or, funnel money into these accounts and not. So I'll start, kind of go in to say, I am not a believer that you let the select few bad apples, right, ruin it for all the good people out there. But this would mean for those of you that are using the checkbook LLC, it would be a double whammy for you. Number one, you'd own more than 10% of an entity, so therefore it would be excluded. But even if you went so far as to have, say, your accountant serve as the manager, this would still not pass muster anymore. Or if you were the manager, obviously that's now prohibited. We are actively engaged with lobbying efforts to eliminate this. But again, this is not necessarily an area that I would say is danger, like some of the other codes, because it doesn't really impact choice. So yeah, I'll stop there. I know we had a bunch of questions coming in. One thing, sorry, and I said I'll stop. Let me just throw this one bit out. You'd also have 2 years to unwind this. For those of you with checkbook controls, what it would mean is that if you're a client of NuView and you've got an LLC at NuView wholly owned by your Roth account or traditional, it really doesn't matter, and it owns 4 investments, you'd have to dissolve the LLC within 2 years and move each individual investment under the custody of your IRA directly, not indirectly through the LLC. So rest assured, they're not telling you your investments no longer can happen unless you've made an investment in that checkbook LLC that has an accredited investor issue. But we don't tend to see that very often. We don't tend to see people using checkbook control to access institutional level investments. But you would have 2 years to unwind it. The good news and solace, if there is any in code we don't like, is that you could easily unwind it. You just would it would be a change in approach to how you held and managed those investments. Sorry, Nate, I didn't mean to tell you I was done and then keep going.
No, great point. So, and again, kind of piggyback off what Jason said, this is not one that surprised me. I actually have kind of mentioned this, in a lot of presentations over the years. I'm not the biggest fan of checkbook control. I think it fits a select group of investors that really need the access to funds and really know how to use the IRA for its intended purpose. But I will tell you that they've been looking at checkbook control LLC since 2015. When they changed the reporting requirements for IRA custodians to start not only telling the IRS what we held as far as account values, but they started asking us to tell them what we held as account or asset types. And when they added those codes that we have to now put on what's called the 5498, I knew right away in 2015 when they had a code for entities, private entities, and they had a separate code for LLCs. That told me right there that the IRS was drilling down on these LLCs, and what else could they be looking at but these, quote, checkbook control LLCs. So this is probably one of those things that they've been looking at this. They probably see some people are not using these checkbook control LLCs for their intended purpose because, again, when you don't have oversight as to what's going on in these LLCs, you're really counting on the IRA owner who's acting as the manager to understand prohibited transactions and all the crazy stuff that we talk about in our education. Now that's going to hurt the people that needed the checkbook control LLC setup and used it the proper way. And I will say it does eliminate some of the options for a select group of people that need it. For instance, people that buy property at auction is one thing that I can think about. It's sometimes hard to take your money out of your IRA and go buy at auction when you need money on the spot. But if it's a sophisticated investor that knows what to do with it, then yes, maybe a checkbook control IRA LLC is a better way to go than trying to get cashier's checks from their IRA custodian and yada, yada, yada. So there are these certain investors that have greater access to investment options because of the ease of use that the LLC gives them. And then there's also, every once in a while you have investments that you need that LLC for maybe some added asset protection. Normally we're not talking about adding more asset protection to your IRA's assets that are already pretty well protected. But I have seen it, for people that want to use their IRA to invest in, a strip mall or some sort of commercial property, that they want some sort of, liability protection on the asset itself, and they're using their IRA, so they need it in an LLC. Well, what this is going to force you to do is you're going to have to somebody that's a non-disqualified person, a third party, you're going to have somebody that manages it for you that's completely separate, that you're not using as a puppet manager. So it is going to affect certain people with certain investment options. As Jason mentioned, there is a 2-year period on this. It's easier to fix these by just switching out managing members to somebody that's completely third party. It's not as I would say detrimental as the accredited investor stuff. But it is going to, cause, a lot of people to do a lot of extra work to kind of unwind these current investments. And I would say it doesn't affect NuView as much, but it does affect a lot of other companies that have made their whole marketing plan to set up these checkbook control IRA LLCs where that's their only business model. So again, that's not going to affect NuView very much, but it will affect the industry, I would say, as a whole for people that have these set up. So anything else you want to add to that, Jason?
Nope. I think you put a nice bow on it. Okay,
perfect. Natalie asked another question, again, just to address this. What about regular LLC and a Roth IRA? Again, it depends on who the managing member is and whether or not the ownership percentages as well is going to play an impact on this. So again, limiting what we're allowed to invest in and kind of what Jason mentioned earlier, changing the game when the game's already started, right? So just unprecedented what we're seeing in some of this stuff. As we wrap up, again, there's some things that really are just no-brainers. Section 138315 talks about IRA owners treated as disqualified people. We've always had that, as an understanding. But what they're really looking to do here is really separate the IRA owner from the IRA's investments, which makes a lot of sense. There's, as an IRA, especially a self-directed IRA custodian, we like that the IRA owner is hands-off because that's really the intended purpose of your IRA. But when you look at these proposed changes, what this tells me is that self-directed IRAs are on their radar. That they've been looking at this, and which there's goods and bads to it. That self-directed IRAs have not been on the IRS's radar for many years, but as more people use them, now the IRS is more involved in what we're allowed to invest in when it goes outside of Wall Street. So just keep that in mind as you go forward, that we want to make sure that we protect our rights and our freedoms to invest in what we know best. But just understand that they're looking at self-directed IRAs, and I say that more as a warning. And Jason kind of mentioned it. Make sure you're following the rules when it comes to your IRA investments. Don't tiptoe in the gray. John Heyer, one of our good friends, John Heyer, he says it, in almost every presentation he has. He says when it comes to just tax code in general, when you're a tax-paying individual, dance in the gray all you want, because at the end of the day, what's going to happen is if you mess up or you make the wrong decision as a tax-paying individual, you usually get a slap on the wrist and a tax penalty, and on you go. But when you mess up with your IRA or 401k, it's more than just a slap on the wrist, especially with IRAs. If they increase the look-back period and they're really looking to make sure people are investing their IRA the way it's intended to be, and if you don't follow those rules and they find it, it's a full distribution of your IRA. All taxes, all penalties. If you do something prohibited, it's considered distributed as of January 1st in the year you did the prohibited transaction. So just a fair warning for people, do not want to mess with the IRS when it comes to these IRAs and 401ks. Just a warning there. Jason, anything you want to add to that as we kind of wrap up?
No, I think we'll kind of get into and wrap up here with last few questions, as well as what can you do, right? How do we take action?
So let's take a couple questions. Rick's asked, how do I unwind real estate investments held in a checkbook LLC? Again, as we kind of mentioned, Rick, if it passed as is, they do not want the IRA owner to act as a managing member or as an officer of that company. So how to unwind the investments would probably be either or, changing the managing member to reflect somebody that's not disqualified to the IRA. Obviously, you're going to have to change bank accounts and all that stuff, or move those assets out of the checkbook LLC and back to ownership in the IRA directly through the IRA custodian. Let's see, any other questions? What does this follow? Rules can't change. Let's see here. A lot of these questions are the same, so I hope I'm addressing all of these. Didn't the 50% prior limit checkbook show LLCs? I think we're pretty much covering everything. A lot of these are duplicates. So let me go to the next slide, and we'll address any questions. Keep the questions coming in, but let's talk about what we do to prevent some of this from passing. And what do you do to take steps to get things done before these rules change, if they change? One of the things that I would urge people to do, and I'll let Jason add some color to this as well, is contact your local representatives. This is something we've been actively doing since the day we heard about this here at NuView. We've been doing a lot of education, a lot of social media posts about it, but is to contact your local congressman or local congresswomen and let them know that this is something that you don't want to pass. Let them know specifically as well. If you have a story about what you're currently invested in and how these changes would affect you personally, I think that really helps when you're submitting letters to your congressman. There's a really good site, and I'm going to mention John Heyer for a second here. John Heyer is a great friend of NuView Trust Company. Most of you guys know who he is. He's a tax attorney, probably one of the foremost authority figures on self-directed IRAs in this country. And he put a great website together called handsoffmyira.com. And what this does, it kind of summarizes everything that's in this proposal, but he also adds some resources for you. He gives a list of all the congressmen in each state that you can contact. He even gives a sample letter that you can use that he wrote that you can just plug and play and insert your own story in there. But I would say the biggest thing that you can do is don't sit there and be quiet. Make your voice heard. This thing is not far from being voted on. I believe December 10th is the date that they're trying to target to add votes to this, and we want to stop it as is. So if you want more information and some resources, I would say go to handsoffmyira.com and get in contact with your local congresspeople right away before it's too late. Jason, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think where we are, we're in the approaching halftime of a 4-quarter game, but we haven't had long to get here, and we don't have long to get where we're going. This will eventually go through the House. Probably with not a ton of edits, just more by design, since the Means and Ways Committee is part of the House, so there's already been some discussions. It will hit the Senate, likely to be kicked back for reconciliation, right? Very likely, and it's not just the IRA stuff, it's the entire proposal. There's plenty of congressional leaders on both sides of the aisle that are voicing opinions that in its current status, it's too big, too much, too fast, and so there's every lobbying group is trying to make a case why our sections are more important, and spend your time, if you're going to reconcile here. The reason why it's so important that we contact every single representative that we can, wherever you are, whoever your representatives are, take the time and contact them. We need to be certain that when reconciliation occurs, that there's enough people that say, a lot of people contacting me about this IRA stuff. Maybe I should ask a few more questions, or maybe I should ask my staffers to dig a little bit. You only get one chance to wave a flag. So no one note that anyone's going to write is going to change this. No one note that anyone's going to write is going to persuade, convince, or change anyone's mind. But every single note that we write is a reminder that the constituents of that particular representative don't believe this is in the best interest of the public. So, as Nate mentioned, when you write them, tell them your story. Why does this matter to you? If you're invested in investments in your community, make that known, right? I've written multiple letters, and my letters say things like, I have an investment in a low-income housing fund that is in my community that is making people's lives better. Yes, I hope to make money while doing it, but it's there to make money for me while providing nicer, better, higher quality places to live for lower income households. Let them know that's the impact. If you use NuView, let them know that there's a small company that's at risk of having issues. If there's financing, banking, attorneys, CPAs in your community that you've used for these products because you wanted to go pay professionals to do it the right way, let them know that so that they understand the impact is in their backyard, and that's the voices to be heard. I'll jump on a question that I just saw pop up that said, how many times can you write? There's no limit. There's probably a law of diminishing returns, just from time, effort, and energy, but there's no limit, and make sure that you're giving them an opportunity to say, we hear you, we understand your concern, genuinely understand it, and we're going to go to bat to get as close to making you, as well as everybody else that they're responsible for, happy in this process. So don't sit around, don't watch this happen. If you do, you give up your right to complain in the event that it passes. So the good news is it's going to leave the House and go to the Senate. We're hearing pretty confidently that it's highly, 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 highly unlikely that it won't come back for reconciliation. That's standard, par for the course. And for something this big, it's just a natural part of the game, which is, we're also hearing why they wrote it to include everything they want, because they know it's going to get peeled back. But point to the sections. They're all listed out. Point to the reasons why. Stick to, my recommendation is stick to the stuff that matters to you and be clear on that. Don't try to speak for everybody else on every IRA section. Speak to where it hits you the most and why. Give good detail. Give them understanding. Most of the representatives have staffers, interns that will read these. They do go through them all. They're required to. Whether they read it in its entirety and understand it doesn't matter. If they see it enough times, hear it from enough different people with enough different sides of the story, it will make an impact, and that is exactly what we have to do to keep this from passing as is.
Yeah, and I'll add this. When Jason mentioned law of diminishing returns, take a little bit of time. If you've already emailed your Congress people, take a little time to maybe get some of your network to also write letters. I know a lot of NuView clients are part of real estate investor groups, CFRI, Go RIA, Jacksonville RIA, Tampa RIA. Make sure everybody in those groups knows about these proposed changes that are coming, because it's going to affect everybody within those groups. So take a little bit of time. If you've done enough writing, maybe spend a little time in just getting the word out there. I know there's a lot of posts on social media, so let's just keep the word out. I want to just address a couple questions that didn't get addressed earlier. Jim McSorley, you had this question, just if anybody knows, what is the penalties on distributions in the event that your IRA is above $10 million and you hit that required minimum distribution that you have to take? Yeah, it's going to be an unfortunate tax situation, but they're not going to charge an early withdrawal penalty on that, but you will ultimately pay taxes if it's in a traditional IRA. So large distribution, but they're not going to hit you with the early distribution penalty on that. Let's see, anything else here? I think that we've...
And Nate, just one thing on that. If you don't take your RMD, so if they tell you, regardless of your age, that you have to take $100,000 out and you don't do it, the penalty is the same as it's 50% of what you were supposed to take out. So if you were supposed to take out 100 and you take nothing out, your penalty is 50,000.
Yep.
So, and because the way that the RMDs work is they're based on a threshold, your RMD is only going to get bigger if you don't take it out, which means the penalty is only going to grow year over year over year. So, I mean, it's an egregious penalty. It's actually probably one of the most severe penalties I've seen in any of the code sections. So yeah, I mean, you have to take it out or you're going to pay way more than it's worth to try to fight that battle.
So make sure everybody goes and visits handsoffmyira.com. Look at the contacts that John Heyer took time to put up there. Reach out to your local Congress people. He's got a letter there that you can use. Add your flavor to it. Add your personal story to it. And then the other thing that I would say is don't wait to see what happens with this as well. Make sure you write your Congress people, but take advantage of the rules as they are now before they change. And what I mean by that is get your Roth IRA set up. If you don't have Roth IRAs set up, get them set up now. Especially get your contributions in and or do your conversions before December 31st, 2021. Because for some of you out there, it may be the last time you're able to do a conversion for the foreseeable future. So with writing your Congress people, with letting them know and getting the word out, make sure that you do the things that you need to do prior to any rules potentially taking change. And for that, if you need to set up IRAs, if you need to set up HSAs to get the additional tax benefits with those, or ESAs, or even your solo 401ks for you self-employed individuals who want to make those after-tax contributions and do in-plan conversions, this may be the last few months you're able to do that for the foreseeable future. So email us at iraspecialists@NuViewTrust.com for any of your account needs or conversion needs, and do that today. Don't hesitate on that. So, Jason, any final words? I really appreciate you being on with me today.
Yeah, follow us on social media. I say that normally I'm not a big social media guy personally, but now's the time. Nate mentioned earlier, it's not just you writing 20 letters. You're better off having your network all write letters and they get 100 letters from 20 different people. The end result will be much better. I'm making a commitment, Nate, and I know the team here can handle it, but let's get this posted today onto our social media. I know we have a lot of stuff on it already. If you're not friends with us on social media, like us, all of our content shareable. I would encourage you to go get on there, like our stuff, and share it, and start driving behavior to those around you. It will take a village, and members of Congress can't just hear it from one or two. They need to hear it from every single solitary person in their community until it makes it crystal clear that it will not be tolerated to take away investment choice. We believe in Main Street. We want to invest in Main Street. And while there's tax loopholes that they want to button up, and we're all for that, it should not impact our ability to invest in Main Street and force us into Wall Street. That shouldn't be tolerated, and we should make our voices heard. So yeah, follow us on our social media accounts, and I'm assuming they're all at NuView Trust in some way, shape, or form. And yeah, share, and encourage.
And if you guys want to watch any of the replay, because I know some people joined in late, and there's a lot of repeat questions coming in, so we're going to have this, we're going to polish it up, and we're going to post it on Facebook. It should be on Facebook by the end of the day. Give us a couple hours, and it'll also be up on YouTube. So if you want to watch the replay, again, follow us on social media, share it to your groups if you can. And again, thanks again, Jason, for spending some time with us today. And thank you, everybody, for joining in. Let's make our voice heard, and let's keep the freedom of choice when it comes to our retirement assets. So thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of the afternoon.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.